There is a sentence most of us have said or heard or both. It goes something like this: "You never listen to me." 4 words. And in those 4 words, an entire architecture of pain is hiding. There is a hurt person. There is an accusation. There is a diagnosis of another human being's character. And there is, buried somewhere underneath it all, a completely legitimate longing to matter to someone, to be received, to not be alone in a room with another person. But the sentence that comes out does not carry that longing. It carries an attack. And the person who receives it does what people do when attacked. They defend, they counterattack, they withdraw. And so the longing goes unmet, and the 2 people move a little further apart, and the next time it will be said louder. Marshall Rosenberg spent his life on a single question that grows out of moments like that one. His question was not how do we win arguments, or how do we get people to do what we want. His question was, what happens to disconnect us from our own compassionate nature so that we behave violently toward each other, and what allows some people to stay connected to that nature even under brutal conditions? He was not asking this as an abstraction. He was asking it as a boy who had watched a race riot tear through Detroit in the summer of 1943, who had been beaten up for his name, and who had also watched his uncle care with tenderness for his dying grandmother. Same species. Same city. 2 utterly different ways of being human. Why? The answer he arrived at and refined over decades is a communication process he called nonviolent communication. It has 4 components, which can be listed in about 10 seconds and take about 10 years to actually inhabit: observation, feeling, need, request. That is it. That is the whole apparatus. And I want to be honest with you at the outset, when you first encounter it, it can sound almost insultingly simple, and the scripted way it is sometimes taught can sound stilted, even a bit precious. But underneath the sometimes awkward phrasing is one of the more radical claims anyone has made about human conflict, that most of what we call disagreement is not actually a conflict of needs at all. It is a conflict of strategies, conducted in a language so saturated with judgment that the needs never get onto the table in the first place. Change the language, and a startling number of conflicts stop being conflicts. Marshall Rosenberg was an American clinical psychologist. He earned his doctorate in clinical psychology and worked, early in his career, in the orbit of Carl Rogers, the founder of person-centered therapy. That lineage matters more than a footnote. Rogers had argued that human beings possess an inherent tendency toward growth, and that what unlocks it is not technique or interpretation, but a particular quality of relationship, unconditional positive regard, genuineness, and above all empathic understanding. Rogers was interested in what happens inside a therapy hour. Rosenberg took the same conviction and asked what would happen if you took it out of the consulting room entirely into a school board meeting, a marriage, a prison, a refugee camp, a negotiation between people who had killed each other's relatives. The model took shape in the late 1960s and through the 1970s. Its early proving ground was not a laboratory. Rosenberg was doing work on racial integration in American schools and institutions in a period when that work was volatile and sometimes dangerous, mediating between people who had every structural reason to distrust one another. This origin is worth holding on to, because a common misreading of nonviolent communication is that it is a politeness protocol for people who are already comfortable, a way of being nice. It was not developed among the comfortable. It was developed in rooms where the stakes were real and the anger was earned. Rosenberg eventually founded an organization to spread the work internationally, trained facilitators on several continents, and took the process into conflict zones and prisons as well as corporate offices and classrooms. His book, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life, became the central text, accompanied by a workbook and an enormous body of recorded workshops. The San Francisco workshop is the most widely watched, which are now scattered across video platforms and podcast feeds. He often taught with 2 hand puppets, a jackal and a giraffe. The jackal for the language of demand, judgment, and blame. The giraffe, the land animal with the largest heart, for the language of needs and empathy. It is a slightly goofy piece of stagecraft that has probably done more pedagogical work than any chapter he wrote. The reach of the ideas has extended further than a self-help book normally travels. The United Nations academic impact has pointed to nonviolent communication as a practical means of pursuing the very first article of the UN Charter, the avoidance of war and the propagation of peace, on the reasoning that the Sustainable Development Goals become more achievable when people's emotional intelligence is higher, and that this process is a credible way of raising it. The framing the UN body uses is that it guides people in reframing how they express themselves, how they hear others, and how they resolve conflicts by focusing on what they are observing, feeling, needing, and requesting, aiming at a compassionate connection in which everyone's needs are valued and met through collaboration. The process has also been folded into the Inner Development Goals Toolkit, an initiative built on the premise that the outer global goals stall without corresponding inner capacities. And on the more commercial end, the publisher has collected endorsements from figures as varied as Anthony Robbins, John Gray, and Deepak Chopra. I want to place one more thing here early because it will make everything that follows more useful. What is the actual evidence? Nonviolent communication has been applied in clinical, educational, organizational, and community settings, and it has been studied in small trials and in scoping reviews. Those studies generally report improvements in self-reported empathy and in interpersonal outcomes. But the evidence base is heterogeneous, and reviewers have been consistent in calling for larger, longer, more rigorous studies and for serious attention to cultural adaptation and to trauma-sensitive implementation. So the honest summary is this: there is real signal, gathered across many settings, and there is not yet the kind of robust, replicated, long-horizon evidence that would let anyone call this settled science. Hold it as a well-tested craft with promising research behind it, not as a proven cure. That is not a knock on the book. It is the posture that lets you take it seriously. Rosenberg's starting move is diagnostic, and it is the part of the work people most often skip past. Before he gives you anything to say, he wants you to notice what you are already saying and what it is quietly doing to you. He gives a name to the habitual mode, life-alienating communication. It comes in several flavors, and once you have the list, you will start hearing them everywhere, including in your own mouth, which is the uncomfortable part. The first is moralistic judgment. This is the reflex to describe anyone whose values differ from ours as wrong or defective. He is lazy. She is controlling. They are entitled. Notice what such a sentence actually accomplishes. It converts a difference in needs into a defect in a person. And Rosenberg's claim, the one that makes the whole system cohere, is that judgments of others are tragic expressions of our own unmet needs. Tragic because they are so likely to produce the opposite of what we want. If I tell you that you are selfish, I have made it maximally difficult for you to give to me, because now anything you give will feel like a confession that I was right about your character. Whereas if I could tell you what I need, I would give you a chance to give it freely, which is the only kind of giving that satisfies anyone. The second flavor is comparison. Comparing yourself to others or others to each other is a reliable way to make life miserable, and it is remarkably efficient at it. Comparison converts every relationship into a ranking, and rankings do not produce connection. The third is the denial of responsibility. Our language is riddled with constructions that quietly deny that we are choosing. I had to, they made me, that's just policy, everyone does it, I couldn't help it. Rosenberg was ferocious on this point, and his own most searing example was the language of those who administered atrocity, who described their acts in the vocabulary of obligation, the passive, bureaucratic grammar of having no choice. The habit is not confined to extremity. Every time you say, I have to go to this job, you have made yourself an object. He would push you, relentlessly, to say instead, I choose to go to this job, because I want to. And then to finish that sentence honestly, because I want the security, because I want to keep my promise to my family, until you find the need underneath, at which point either the resentment dissolves or you discover that you no longer wish to make that choice. Both outcomes are better than resentment. The fourth is the communication of demands. A demand is a request that carries an implied punishment for refusal, blame, guilt, withdrawal, a cold week. And here is the practical test Rosenberg offers, which is unusually clean. It is a demand if the other person is punished, in any currency, for saying no. Most of us believe we are making requests. Most of us discover, if we run the test on our own behavior for a week, that we are making demands with better manners. Under all four sits a deeper structure that he traced through history, a worldview organized around deserving. The idea that some people deserve reward and others deserve punishment, and that the job of authority is to sort them. He argued this vocabulary is well suited to hierarchy. It makes populations easier to govern and profoundly ill-suited to connection. Once you are asking who deserves what, you have stopped asking what everyone needs, and you have almost certainly stopped listening. So, observation, feeling, need, request. Let me take them one at a time, because each one has a trap in it. Observation means separating what a camera would record from what you concluded about it. This sounds trivial. It is not. The great majority of the sentences we use to describe conflict are evaluations wearing the costume of observations. You are always late is not an observation. It is a generalization. The observation is, the last 3 times we agreed to meet at 7, you arrived after 7:30. He is aggressive is not an observation. He raised his voice and pushed his chair back is. Rosenberg cited a line from the Indian philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti to the effect that observing without evaluating is the highest form of human intelligence, and he meant it, not as a spiritual flourish, but as an engineering specification. Because the moment your sentence contains a generalization, the other person's attention leaves the situation entirely and goes to defending their character. You have lost them before you have said what you wanted. The trap here is the word always, and its cousins never, constantly, and every time. They feel like intensifiers. They function as escape hatches. They let the listener disprove your entire complaint by finding one counterexample. Feeling means naming what is actually happening inside you, in a vocabulary of emotion rather than a vocabulary of thought. Rosenberg found that most adults have a shockingly thin feelings vocabulary, a fact he attributed partly to schooling that trains you to say what the right answer is rather than what is true for you. And he identified a specific counterfeit that trips up nearly everyone, the pseudo-feeling. When you say I feel ignored, I feel manipulated, I feel abandoned, I feel disrespected, you have not named a feeling. You have named an interpretation of what someone else did to you, and you have smuggled a verdict inside the word feel. The listener hears the accusation, not the vulnerability. The actual feeling underneath ignored might be lonely, or hurt, or discouraged. Those words are far more exposing, which is precisely why we avoid them, and precisely why they work. Need is the load-bearing element, and it is where the whole model either becomes powerful or stays a party trick. Rosenberg's proposal is that feelings are signals, that every emotion arises from a need being met or unmet, and that needs themselves are universal. Not universal in the sense that everyone has the same preferences, but universal in the sense that the deep categories are shared across every culture and every human being: sustenance, safety, rest, connection, belonging, empathy, honesty, meaning. Autonomy, competence, play, beauty, mourning, contribution. Notice that none of these name a specific person, a specific action, or a specific outcome. That is the crucial property. Autonomy is a need. You letting me choose the restaurant is a strategy. Connection is a need. You texting me back within an hour is a strategy. Almost every conflict we experience as irreconcilable is a collision of strategies. And strategies collide constantly because there is only one restaurant and one evening. Needs, by contrast, almost never collide. Two people can both have a need for consideration, both have a need for rest, both have a need for respect at the same time, without contradiction. So Rosenberg's operational instruction is, get the conversation down to the level of needs, because at that level the problem usually turns out to be a puzzle rather than a war. And puzzles have more solutions than the two people started with. The bridge between feeling and need is a sentence structure he uses relentlessly. I feel this, because I need that. Not because you did that. This is a small grammatical change with enormous consequences because it relocates the cause of your feeling from the other person's behavior to your own unmet need. The other person's action is the stimulus. Your need is the cause. Those are different, and the difference is the whole ballgame. It is what lets you speak your pain with full force without laying a charge at anyone's feet, which is the only condition under which most people can actually hear pain. Request is the last component and, in my view, the most frequently botched. A request must be positive, what you do want rather than what you do not. It must be concrete and doable in the present. And it must be genuinely refusable. Do not disrespect me is not a request. It is a mood expressed as an instruction, and nobody knows what to do with it. Would you be willing to tell me when you need to end this conversation, rather than leaving the room, is a request. Rosenberg also distinguishes action requests from connection requests, and this distinction saves conversations. Sometimes what you want is behavior. Often, especially in the hot part of a conflict, what you actually want first is to know you are understood. Would you be willing to tell me what you heard me say? That request, asked without sarcasm, resolves an astonishing amount of trouble because most escalation is two people each convinced the other has not grasped them. Half of the book is about expressing yourself. The other half, the half that is harder and, I would argue, more transformative, is about receiving other people. And here Rosenberg's definition of empathy is narrower and more demanding than the everyday usage. Empathy, as he means it, is not sympathy. It is not advice. It is not reassurance, not one-upping with your own similar story, not explaining, not consoling, not correcting the facts, not fixing. He has a catalog of the things we do instead of empathizing, and reading it is a small humiliation, because they are all things we do with the sincere intention of helping, giving advice, educating, commiserating, interrogating, evaluating, telling them it will be fine. Every one of those moves takes the attention off the speaker's experience and puts it somewhere else. The instruction he gives is startlingly austere: presence. Do not do something, be there. Empathy is the attempt to guess, from the outside, what the other person is observing, feeling, needing, and requesting, and to reflect it back so they can correct you. This means the practice of empathy is not agreement. You can empathize with someone whose position you find abhorrent because you are not endorsing their strategy, you are locating their need. This is the part of the work that scales beyond family arguments into genuine conflict resolution, and it is why the process kept ending up in prisons, in mediations, and in places where reconciliation seemed impossible. Rosenberg's argument, which he tested in some very hostile rooms, is that no one is capable of hearing another person's pain until their own pain has been heard. That is the ordering principle. If you try to explain yourself to an enraged person, you will fail, not because your explanation is poor, but because there is no room in them to receive it. Empathy first, always, and if you cannot give it, that is important data about you, not a verdict on them. Which leads to the piece of this that people underestimate: you cannot give what you do not have. Rosenberg is direct about the necessity of self-empathy and about what he called emergency first aid, the recognition that when you are too activated to be present, the honest and skillful move is to say so, to ask for a pause, to give yourself the same four-step attention you would give another. Screaming, he noted with characteristic dryness, is also an option, provided you scream at a wall rather than a person. And then there is the hardest receiving skill of all: hearing a difficult message without taking it as an attack. When someone says something harsh, you have four options. You can blame yourself and collapse into guilt. You can blame them and counterattack. You can sense your own feelings and needs. Or you can sense theirs. The first two are the ones we default to, and they are the ones that guarantee escalation. The last two are, in Rosenberg's framing, the only ones that lead anywhere. Behind every attack is a person in pain making a very poor request. Learning to hear the request inside the insult is a skill, it is learnable, and it takes years. Two applications deserve their own attention because they cut against strong intuitions. The first is anger. Rosenberg refuses both of the standard positions. He does not tell you to suppress anger, and he does not endorse venting it, which he thought did little except deepen the groove. His position is that anger is neither wrong nor useless, it is a signal, and specifically it is the signal that you are thinking a judgment. Anger, in his analysis, is caused not by what the other person did, but by the thought you are having about what they did, the should, the deserve, the how could they. That is why anger feels so certain and so righteous. It is manufactured by a verdict. The steps he offers for anger are concrete. Stop and breathe and do nothing. Identify the judgments you are running, do not deny them, find them. Then translate. Underneath every judgment is an unmet need, and if you can locate it, the anger transforms into the feeling that was there before the judgment covered it, which is usually hurt, fear, disappointment, or grief. Then speak from the need. He is explicit that full expression of anger requires this translation, because shouting a judgment is not full expression at all. It is a substitute for it that leaves the actual need unspoken. The point is not to become a person who never gets angry. The point is to become a person for whom anger is information rather than a detonation. The second application is praise, and this one reliably makes managers and parents uncomfortable. Rosenberg argues that compliments and praise are frequently judgments, positive judgments, but judgments all the same, and that using them to reinforce behavior is a form of manipulation, however benevolent. Good job, you are so smart. That was excellent. Each of these positions the speaker as the evaluator of another person's worth. What he proposes instead is appreciation that is not a verdict but a report with 3 parts: the concrete action the person took, the specific need of yours it met, and the feeling that arose in you as a result. When you stayed late to finish the draft, my need for support was met, and I felt enormous relief. That is longer and clumsier than good job, and it lands in a completely different place, because it contains actual information, and it does not put anyone in the position of being graded. There is a bigger principle underneath both of these. Rosenberg's aim is never to change someone's behavior. It sounds strange to say about a communication method, but he was insistent. If your goal is to get someone to do something, you are still operating in the world of demands, and people can smell it. The stated goal is a quality of connection in which people give to each other willingly, out of what he called the natural joy of contributing to another's well-being. Compliance obtained through guilt, shame, or fear has costs that come due later, in resentment, in withdrawal, in the slow erosion of goodwill. Giving that arises from a genuine grasp of another's need has no such bill attached. That is the whole economic argument of the book, and it is why the process cannot be used purely as a technique. Deployed as a manipulation tactic with the vocabulary intact, it becomes what practitioners wryly call polite jackal, the same coercion in a softer voice, and people detect it quickly. Let me be a useful guide rather than an enthusiast, and name the honest tensions. The phrasing problem is real. The full formula, when I observe X, I feel Y. Because I need Z, would you be willing to W, sounds like a person reading from a card, and in ordinary conversation that stiltedness can itself create distance. Rosenberg's own answer was that the 4 components are a consciousness, not a script. The words are training wheels, and the goal is the awareness, not the sentence structure. That is right, but it means the early stage of learning is genuinely awkward, and many people quit there. The power problem is more serious. Critics have noted that a method centered on mutual empathy can, in situations of real power asymmetry, put the burden of emotional labor on the person with less power, asking the harassed employee to empathize with the harasser's needs. Rosenberg's response was that the process explicitly includes what he called the protective use of force. When there is no time for dialogue, you may act to protect life or rights, with the intent to protect rather than to punish, and you return to dialogue afterward. Empathy is not passivity, and it is not a requirement to stay in a harmful room. But it is fair to say the book gives more pages to the dialogue than to the structural analysis, and readers in genuinely coercive situations should hold that gap in mind. There is also the universality question, which is where the research reviewers land. The claim that needs are universal while strategies are cultural is elegant, and it may well be broadly true, but the expression of feelings, the directness of requests, and the very acceptability of naming a personal need vary enormously across cultures. Reviewers calling for cultural adaptation are pointing at something substantive. So is the call for trauma-sensitive implementation. For someone with a trauma history, being asked to sit with a feeling and name a need is not a neutral exercise, and the process needs to be delivered with that awareness rather than as a universal drill. None of this dismantles the model. It positions it. This is a craft with a strong internal logic and a growing, but still immature evidence base. best used with judgment. Here is what I would want you to carry out of this. Judgment is a tragic expression of an unmet need. When you catch yourself diagnosing someone's character, treat it as an alarm bell pointing back at yourself and ask what you are needing that you are not getting. The judgment is the symptom. The need is the information. Separate observation from evaluation, and be suspicious of always and never. If your complaint contains a generalization, the other person will spend the conversation defending their identity rather than addressing the situation. Watch for pseudo-feelings. If the word after I feel is really a description of what someone did to you, ignored, dismissed, manipulated, betrayed, you have expressed a verdict, not a feeling, and the listener will respond to the verdict. Find the plainer, more exposing word underneath. Say because I need, not because you did. The other person's behavior is the stimulus for your feeling. Your unmet need is its cause. This one grammatical shift lets you say hard things without assigning blame. Distinguish needs from strategies and negotiate at the level of needs. Strategies are scarce and collide. Needs are universal and rarely do. Most impasses are two people defending a single strategy each, unaware that 4 other strategies would meet both sets of needs. Make requests, not demands, and apply the test honestly. Is the person punished, in any currency including your silence, for saying no? If yes, it was a demand. Ask for connection before you ask for action. Would you be willing to tell me what you heard me say is not a rhetorical move, it is often the entire fix, because most escalation is mutual conviction of not being understood. Empathize before you explain. Nobody can hear you while their own pain is unheard. And if you have nothing left to give, say so and take a pause. That is a skilled move, not a failure. Anger is a signal that you are running a judgment. Do not vent it and do not swallow it. Find the should underneath it, translate it into the need, and speak from there. Replace praise with appreciation. Say what the person did, what need of yours it met, and how you feel. It is more work and it is not a grade, which is why it lands. And the master key, the goal is never compliance. It is a quality of connection in which giving becomes voluntary. Any use of these tools to extract behavior will be detected and will fail slowly. I want to end with the thing that took me longest to appreciate about this book. It is easy to receive nonviolent communication as a technique for handling other people, a better set of moves for difficult conversations, a de-escalation protocol. Read that way, it will produce modest results and a certain amount of self-consciousness. But that is not really what it is. Underneath the 4 steps is a claim about what human beings are, that beneath every hostile act, every withdrawal, every ugly thing anyone has said to you, there is a person with a need trying, badly, to meet it. And that the language we have inherited, the language of good and bad, of deserving and not deserving, of what people should do and what they have coming, makes that need nearly impossible to see, in others and in ourselves. Rosenberg was making a bet that you cannot prove in advance, and that most people find implausible until they have watched it work, that if you can get to the need underneath the attack loses most of its power and something else becomes possible. He tested that bet in some of the least promising rooms available on this planet. He was not naive about what people do to each other. He had watched a city burn when he was 9 years old. His optimism was not a temperament. It was a conclusion he had argued himself into and then spent 40 years checking. The practice does not require you to believe him. It requires something smaller and more manageable. The next time you feel the surge, the certainty that someone has wronged you, the sentence already forming, you pause for 1 breath and ask 2 questions. What am I feeling? And what do I need that I am not getting? You will often not know the answers immediately, which is itself informative. But asking changes what comes out of your mouth. And what comes out of your mouth changes what comes back. That is a small enough intervention to try today, in a conversation you are probably already dreading. For words are enough to start a fight. It turns out that a slightly different 4, observation, feeling, need, request, are enough to end one.